They called her Granny Bolt. Not to her face, of course, but the nickname floated through the hangar like oil smoke clinging to the rafters. She was easy to mock. 62 gray-haired, slow-moving in her oil-stained coveralls, she spent her days tightening bolts on aircraft. She'd never fly and wiping down cockpit glass like it still meant something. The young airmen laughed as she passed. One of them, Rodriguez, timed how long it took her to remove a single panel. He waved his phone like a stopwatch, grinning while his buddies chuckled over lunch. To them, she was background noise. Some old mechanic who hadn't gotten the memo that her time was up. No one asked why she still came to work. No one cared that the aircraft she touched seemed to matter to her more than they ever would to the people flying them. 3 days later, those same young men would stand in stunned silence. The woman they mocked would climb into the cockpit of a nearly gutted A-10, fly it straight into live combat, and save 43 American lives. But today, she was just the quiet figure they barely noticed. Walking among them, like a ghost from a war they'd only read about holding a wrench, like it still had meaning. And somewhere deep inside her, something was waiting. Janet Kramer never made a scene. She moved through the hangar with the steady patience of someone who'd spent a lifetime fixing things most people didn't understand. At 62, she didn't care for chatter or office politics. Her silver hair was always pulled back into a regulation bun, even though she hadn't worn a flight suit in years. Her hands were rough-stained with grease, her knuckles stiff from decades of turning wrenches. Most people just saw an old woman, the kind who shows up to work early, takes her lunch alone, and leaves without saying much. She drove a dusty pickup, brought her tools from home, and kept an old leather-bound notebook in her locker. People called her a relic, but they didn't see the way her fingers paused just a second longer on the A-10's fuselage. They didn't notice how gently she touched the cockpit controls, as if saying hello to an old friend who'd once helped her survive. Janet had been assigned to decommission that bird. It was an old Warthog, worn and patched, scheduled for the scrapyard. She didn't protest the order. She just asked to handle it herself. Every day she worked on it alone, cataloging parts with meticulous care, removing panels with slow precision. To the rest of the crew, it looked like she was just slow. But for Janet, it was something else entirely. A ritual. A farewell. The younger crew didn't understand. They cracked jokes, whispered theories. Some said she used to be a pilot, but that seemed ridiculous to them. What kind of pilot ends up turning wrenches in retirement? Janet never corrected them. She wasn't there to prove anything. She'd already proven it when it counted long ago in skies most of them would never fly. She didn't keep photos on her desk. No medals on the wall, no hints about the life she'd lived before civilian work. Her office was a metal toolbox and a thermos of black coffee. But every so often in quiet moments she would lean against the A-10's nose and close her eyes. Maybe she was remembering something. Or maybe she was just listening. She always said aircraft had a way of talking back if you knew how to listen. There was a calmness about Janet that made some people uncomfortable, like she'd seen too much and carried it quietly. She didn't try to keep up with the new tech or the fast pace of the younger crew. She just did her job steady and unshaken. What no one realized was that this job was the last thread connecting her to who she used to be. Because Janet Kramer had flown missions most people wouldn't believe. She'd landed planes with holes the size of dinner plates, carried out extractions under enemy fire, and returned home with more than scars. But war doesn't come with long applause or proper goodbyes. When she'd hit the mandatory retirement line, the uniform came off, but the mission never really ended. Now she stood every morning in Hangar 4 pulling tools from her kit, like it was still 1995, working on aircraft that once roared through battlefields. The young airmen didn't know. They saw coveralls, not combat stripes. But the A-10 knew her. It remembered. And deep down she believed some part of it was watching her right back. Desert Rock. Airbase didn't feel like a place for old memories. Everything was glass steel and precision. The hangars stretched wide under the Nevada sky, spotless and humming with movement. Digital screens blinked from every wall. Automated diagnostics replaced most manual checks. The pace was fast, efficient, sharp, like the young airmen who moved through it in crisp uniforms and spotless boots. They walked in packs, laughing, loud heads bent over phones or schematics. Their voices echoed through the hangars, filled with confidence and speed. No one slowed down. Janet moved differently. Not because she was slow, but because she took her time on purpose. Her coveralls were old, the knees faded from kneeling, the name patch worn to a soft blur. Compared to the others, she looked like she'd stepped out of a different decade. No tablet in her hand, no earbuds in her ears, just a clipboard, a pen, and the quiet sense that she knew more than she ever said. The others didn't quite know what to do with her. She wasn't one of them, but she was always around. She didn't ask questions, didn't correct their work. She just moved from plane to plane like a shadow that refused to fade. Some of them thought she was harmless. Some thought she was a joke. But most just didn't notice her at all. She blended into the background like a tool left on the bench. The base itself seemed to agree. The machines were sleek, the lights unforgiving, the routine sterile and fast. There was no room for softness or sentiment in the rhythms of the day. Janet didn't try to change that. She kept her head down, worked with quiet hands, and said as little as possible. But every step she took through that polished world felt like it belonged to a different kind of story. The warplanes they now called obsolete were the same ones that once brought people like her home. Now they were being stripped, shipped, or sold, and the people who once flew them were mostly forgotten. Janet understood that. She didn't ask for attention or praise, but even in that cold, spotless place, she never let herself disappear. She walked with purpose, even if no one else could see it. It started with whispers passed between toolboxes and coffee breaks. They called her things like Granny Wrench or Grandma Bolt, as if her age made her harmless. Some of the younger ones joked she needed a walker more than a wrench. Rodriguez was the worst. He was loud, quick, with a smirk, and always performing for an audience. One morning he timed how long it took Janet to unfasten a panel, then announced it to the whole hangar like it was a comedy bit. Brooks laughed along, nudging Rodriguez, tossing out comments about how Janet probably used Morse code instead of radios. They didn't lower their voices. They didn't hide their laughter. They treated her like background noise. Janet didn't respond. She kept working slow and steady, her face unreadable. But she heard every word. The other crew members shifted uncomfortably, caught between amusement and awkwardness. Rodriguez leaned over her workbench once, watching her check wiring diagrams. He said something about needing to update her training manual from the Stone Age. Brooks added that maybe she needed color-coded crayons to keep up. Janet didn't flinch. She just turned a page in her manual and kept reading. But her hands moved a little slower that day, her jaw set tighter. The disrespect wasn't hidden. It was out in the open, passed off as jokes. But the weight of it pressed against her shoulders all the same. She had worked too long, known too much to be taken for a fool. They didn't know who she was, and that ignorance was their shield. For now. The jokes didn't stay harmless for long. Rodriguez stopped whispering and started performing. Every time Janet reached for a tool or flipped through a manual, he made sure someone was watching. At first it was small things. Someone switched her torque specs printouts, so she had to double-check everything by hand. Then a wrench from her personal kit went missing, only to show up days later inside a supply bin across the hangar. Janet said nothing. She just adjusted, retested, and kept going. But each day the work got slower, not from age, but from the extra care she had to take in a place where someone clearly wanted her to fail. Sergeant Williams didn't help. He was sharp-voiced and always moving fast, barking orders like every job was a crisis. When Janet asked for an extra day to safely disassemble a complex hydraulic system, he cut her off mid-sentence. He told her this wasn't a museum and she wasn't there to preserve memories. The plane needed to be gutted and ready for shipment by Friday, not when she finished reminiscing. Then he walked off before she could respond. Rodriguez loved that. He started timing her again, loudly announcing her pace to anyone nearby. 42 minutes for a single panel. Might as well teach a tortoise to fly. Even Park, who usually gave Janet a kind smile in passing, looked uncomfortable. No one said anything. No one wanted to be the next target. Janet worked in silence, surrounded by quiet complicity. She knew the sabotage wasn't random. One morning she found a hydraulic line half loosened. It could have caused a serious leak if she hadn't caught it in time. When she reported it, Williams waved it off. Maybe your eyes are just tired. Happens with age. Janet nodded. She wrote down every incident in a small notebook she kept in her locker. Not for revenge, for clarity, because even dignity needed a record when it was being chipped away one bolt at a time. She didn't ask for backup. She didn't ask for sympathy. She kept working with hands that didn't shake and eyes that still knew what they were doing. but the walls around her were closing in. And still, no one knew who she really was. The clang echoed through the hangar like a shot. Janet turned just in time to see her toolbox hit the floor, spilling decades of carefully kept tools across the concrete. Rodriguez stood over it laughing, one hand still outstretched as if the push had been accidental. "Oops," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Wouldn't want anyone to trip." His grin was smug, daring her to react. Janet didn't speak. She bent down slowly, knees stiff, fingers closing around the familiar weight of her torque wrench. It was older than Rodriguez, scratched from use, but still balanced in her hand like it had been forged for her grip. She picked up each tool with care, placing them back in the box one by one. Around her, the laughter softened, replaced by the hum of awkward silence. But she didn't look up. Not yet. Something shifted in her chest. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter, older. It was the moment you stop hoping someone will change and start deciding what you'll do next. Rodriguez tried another jab, something about retirement coming late for some people. She didn't answer. When she stood, her back was straight, her shoulders level. She looked at him, and something in her stare made him shift on his feet. It wasn't rage. It was memory. A flood of images and missions and hours in cockpits that he would never know. It sat in her eyes like a weight he couldn't name. She turned without a word and walked back to the aircraft. Her pace hadn't changed, but her presence had. For the first time, the hangar seemed to feel her there. Park glanced her way from across the room and hesitated, her expression tight. Janet gave her the smallest nod, then opened the maintenance log and began writing with steady hands. She was done being invisible. She would not be broken. Not by time. Not by boys in uniforms. Not by a system that had forgotten what real strength looked like. And something in the way she stood told everyone watching that maybe they'd underestimated the wrong woman. Janet sat alone in the break room, her sandwich untouched on the table. The voices of the younger crew floated in from down the hall, all energy and ease. She listened without listening, eyes resting on the stained cover of her maintenance manual, like it held something more than instructions. She didn't often let her mind drift, but today it did. It went back to the valleys of Kandahar, the ridges of Mosul, the long, silent minutes circling overhead, waiting for the call. She remembered the static in her headset, the voice of a young Marine whispering coordinates with fear he was trying to hide. She'd flown in low, cutting through heat and chaos, her hands calm on the stick. The A-10 had been steady beneath her, always steady, even when parts of it were on fire. She had trusted it the way you trust your own heartbeat. Janet never forgot the faces of those she brought home. She never forgot the silence after a strike, the way the radio would go quiet for just a breath before someone said they were still alive. She carried those moments with her like medals no one ever saw. She never talked about it. Not because she didn't care, but because most people wouldn't understand. Or worse, they'd treat it like a story, something to be impressed by. She wasn't interested in being impressive. She was interested in being useful. When she left the service, the medals went into a drawer, the uniforms into boxes. She found work on base because the smell of jet fuel still made her feel like herself. It was the one place that still made sense. People thought silence was weakness, that if you didn't defend yourself, you had no defense. Janet had spent her life saving lives without asking for applause. She didn't need validation. She needed purpose. Sergeant Park was the only one who looked at her without judgment. The young woman brought her spare parts without being asked, gave her updates without attitude. One afternoon, Park lingered a moment longer and asked how Janet had learned to run flight diagnostics without needing the manual. Janet looked up, eyes tired but kind, and said she'd picked things up along the way. Park didn't press. She just nodded and said the way Janet worked reminded her of her grandfather, who used to fly refueling tankers. There was respect in her voice, not curiosity. Janet appreciated that. She knew Park saw something the others didn't. Maybe not the whole truth, but enough to treat her like she mattered. It didn't fix everything, but it helped. Janet returned to the hangar that evening long after the others had gone. She walked past the half-stripped A-10, her hand brushing along its skin like she was checking for a pulse. She stood there in the quiet, alone with the plane and the memories. In the corner of the equipment room, her flight suit still hung where she left it years ago. The name tape had faded, but it still said Kramer. She reached out and touched the fabric, fingers trembling just slightly. She hadn't worn it in 2 decades, but she remembered every time she had. Not for glory, for the people who never came back, and for the ones who only did because she had been there at the right moment. Her strength was never in her voice. It was in her hands and the way she stood when others ran. And now, with each small injustice piling up, she felt something old and steady returning. Not anger, not ego. Just the quiet, unshakable clarity of someone who knew exactly who she was. The call came at 3:18 a.m., slicing through the silence like a blade. Janet woke before the second ring, heart already pounding. Her old secure line, the one no one else used anymore, buzzed against the kitchen counter. She didn't need to ask who it was. The voice on the other end was tight-clipped and familiar. Mike Stevens, her old squadron mate. His words were few, but they hit hard. Troops pinned down in hostile territory. No air support available. They needed someone who knew the Warthog like it was part of them. She didn't ask why they called her. She just said, "Give me 20 minutes," and hung up. The air felt cold as she moved through her trailer, feet steady on the floor. No hesitation. She grabbed the duffel from the closet, the one she hadn't touched in years. The flight suit was still folded inside. It smelled faintly of fuel and time. She pulled it on slow, but sure, the fabric stiff at first, then familiar. She zipped it up and looked in the mirror. Not the woman from the break room. Not Granny Wrench. Lightning. She drove through the dark desert without music, the headlights cutting long streaks over the empty road. Nellis Air Base rose ahead like a memory made real. The guard at the gate recognized her. His jaw dropped. He didn't ask questions. He just waved her through. Inside Hangar 7, chaos was already moving. Crews scrambled around the remaining A-10's tools, flying orders shouted. Janet stepped out of her truck and walked in like she belonged there. Because she did. Major Woods looked up from a tablet, eyes wide. Stevens came forward, shock fading into something like relief. Janet nodded once. 4 birds left. 1 nearly stripped. But she'd been working on it for days. She knew what it needed. She knew what it could still do. They asked if she could fly. She answered by reciting avionics protocols from memory, flight readiness tests, updated threat libraries. Every word, crisp, calm, ready. Woods tried to protest. She hadn't flown in active duty for 20 years. Janet held up a logbook filled with test flights. She was current. She was rated. She had spent the last 6 months putting this bird back together with her own hands. The airmen started to gather, watching from behind tools and carts. Park was the first to move, stepping beside Janet without hesitation. She asked what needed fixing. Janet gave instructions without pause. They moved like crew, like old times. Rodriguez stood frozen near the workbench, unable to speak. She didn't look at him. She looked at the plane. Tail number 072. Her bird. Her mission. Someone asked who would fly it. Janet didn't blink. She said she would. The room went still. They didn't see her the same way anymore. Not the tired old mechanic. Not the woman who moved too slow. They saw the pilot. The leader. The one who answered calls no one else could. Stevens gave a quiet nod. Woods didn't argue again. Janet turned back toward the aircraft. As she climbed the ladder, the hangar lights caught the faded patch on her shoulder. Lightning. It still fit. She strapped in with steady hands, fingers finding switches like they never forgot. The A-10 powered up beneath her like it had been waiting. The ground crew scrambled to finish prep, urgency replacing disbelief. Park leaned in for one final check. Janet gave her a smile. Not big, but solid. It was time. Not to prove anything, but because it was her job. Always had been. The wheels lifted off the tarmac just as the sun broke the horizon. Janet adjusted her grip on the throttle, her body sinking back into the rhythm like it never left. The A-10 responded with a deep, familiar hum, steady and strong beneath her. She climbed fast, skimming the edge of legal altitude. The comms crackled. Viper unit was still under fire, surrounded from 3 sides. No air support had arrived. They were running out of time. Janet radioed her distance-confirmed friendly positions and asked for smoke. Orange. Always orange. She spotted it seconds later, thin curls rising from a narrow ridge. Beyond it, flashes of gunfire peppered the hills. She banked left, dropped low, and opened her first pass. The cannon thundered. Dust and debris flew where a machine gun nest had been seconds before. Ground fire answered. Tracers zipped past her canopy like red needles. She didn't flinch. She adjusted altitude, flipped systems, and circled back. Her second pass took out a mortar crew dug in behind a rock wall. The valley echoed with shock waves. Her breath stayed even. Viper reported armor incoming. 3 tanks moving from the south. Janet armed her Mavericks, locked targets, and pulled in tight. First missile away. Direct hit. The tank vanished in a plume of black smoke. Second missile screamed into the ridgeline. 2, then 3. The last tank crew jumped out and ran. The Warthog was a relic to some, but here it was a monster, and she was its heartbeat. She circled again, checking visual markers. Viper called out medevac trouble. 1 bird couldn't land. Hot zone. Janet checked her fuel. Almost gone. Enough to get home. Maybe. She stayed in the sky. No hesitation. Just a call to rescue 7. Clear a path. Now. She came in low, spraying the tree line with the last of her 30mm. The sound shook the valley. It always did. Smoke curled. Fire caught. The enemy scattered. The medevac came in behind her wheels, down rotors screaming. Janet climbed again, altitude bleeding fast. Her fuel warning flashed red. She didn't respond. Nellis called in, asked for status. She told them the truth, running on fumes and prayers. But the boys were safe. All accounted for. That was enough. Her engines sputtered 30 miles out. She didn't panic. She trimmed her descent, scanned for the strip, and eased the bird home. No power, no backup, just skill and memory. She landed clean. No bounce, no drift, just rubber and asphalt. She rolled to a stop as fire crews raced in, eyes wide with disbelief. When the canopy opened, they expected a hot shot. They got Janet Kramer. Flight suit, wrinkled eyes clear. She climbed down and walked past the crowd, helmet in hand. No drama, just a job done. Inside the hangar, silence met her return. Then applause. It started slow, then spread. The same hands that once pointed and laughed now clapped hard enough to shake the walls. She didn't raise her arms or smile wide. She just nodded once. To them, to the bird, to the ones she brought home. 43 lives, 1 old pilot, 0 regrets. The Warthog could rest now, but Janet wasn't finished. Not yet. The landing gear hissed as it met the runway, and the A-10 coasted to a stop, engines sighing like they knew they'd just run their last mission. Janet sat still for a moment, hands resting on the controls. The cockpit smelled like fuel and heat, familiar and final. When she climbed down, a wall of silence met her. Then 1 airman clapped, then another. Soon the hangar filled with the sound of every hand coming together, louder than takeoff, louder than cannon fire. It rolled through the space like thunder. She didn't smile wide, just a small, steady nod as she walked past them. Her boots scuffed the floor she used to clean. Now it felt like a path made for her, a long overdue welcome. Rodriguez stepped forward, hat in hand. His voice was quiet, rough at the edges. He said he was sorry. For everything. Janet looked him in the eye and saw the kid beneath the swagger. She nodded once. That was enough. General Harrison arrived not long after his presence, crisp and sharp. He spoke in front of the assembled crew, voice firm but full of something like awe. He said her aircraft would not be stripped. It would be preserved. A testament to skill, sacrifice, and service that never expired. He turned to Janet and said they had a new assignment for her. One she didn't have to fly. She would stay on base. Teach. Mentor. Lead the next generation, not from behind a desk, but with the same hands that had just saved 43 lives. The airman who once ignored her now stood at attention when she passed, not because of rank, because of respect, real, earned, and unshakable. In the days that followed, her hangar filled with new eyes watching her work. They asked questions, took notes, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Janet moved among them with quiet ease. She didn't talk much about what she'd done. She didn't have to. The A-10, now mounted in the courtyard, did all the talking. Her name was on the plaque, not just as a pilot, as a legend. And in the hearts of those who had once doubted her, something shifted. For good. The base felt different now. Not louder, not busier, just more aware. People looked each other in the eye a little longer, listened more, slowed down enough to see what used to be invisible. Rodriguez changed the most. He still cracked jokes, but they came with purpose, not mockery. He stayed late in the hangar some nights, asking Janet to walk him through things she used to do without being noticed. Brooks started leading drills with more care. He watched how Janet explained complex systems with quiet patience and mirrored it. He told the new recruits her story like it was a chapter they had to carry forward. Sergeant Park was promoted, and the first thing she did was request Janet for training sessions. She called it the lightning briefing. Once a month, every crew member sat down to hear not war stories, but lessons in endurance, discipline, and grace under pressure. Janet's plane stood just outside the command center. The engines were cold, the wheels locked, but the skin still held the scorches from its final mission. Trainees ran their fingers over the shell eyes wide. She never once told them to be impressed. She just told them to be prepared. In the locker room, where once there were jokes, now there were questions. What would Janet do? How would she handle this? And maybe more important, why hadn't they seen her for who she was? The respect didn't come from one flight. It came from realizing what she carried silently for years, and how easily it could have been lost, buried under assumptions and noise. Janet never asked for praise. She never raised her voice. But she left a mark deeper than medals or headlines. She reminded them that heroes don't always arrive loud. Sometimes they've been here all along, waiting for the sky to call them back. And long after the stories fade, her lesson will stay. Skill never rusts. Grace never ages. And strength, real strength, doesn't need to shout.